In a world where appearances dictate worth, where the homeless are ghosts to the hurried masses, ignored, judged, and swiftly forgotten, one woman's story shattered the illusion. Grace Whitfeld, once the daughter of unimaginable wealth, found herself cast into the shadows by family greed and lies. She became the woman everyone overlooked, the homeless figure people averted their eyes from, as if her existence were a mirror too harsh to confront. But beneath the rags, beneath the dirt and despair, lay a truth so powerful it would rewrite destinies. They called her the hidden heiress, mocked her as the woman they looked down on, and believed her to be homeless, not hopeless. But what they didn't see was the storm brewing beneath the surface, a storm of resilience, of secrets waiting to be unleashed, and of a legacy that would rise from the ashes. Today, we uncover the journey of a woman who refused to be defined by the world's blindness. Her story isn't just about wealth or betrayal. It's about the unbreakable spirit that turned invisibility into a weapon of redemption. Are you ready to witness the moment she revealed her true self? A moment that left the world speechless and proved that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places? Grace Whitfeld huddled in the shadow of the old oak tree, her once elegant hands now rough and calloused from the harsh grip of life on the streets. The threadbare coat she wore, a relic from a time when she was someone else, hardly shielded her from the biting wind. Her eyes, once bright with the promise of a privileged upbringing, now mirrored the dull gray of the pavement beneath her worn-out boots. The city hurried past her, a blur of faces that turned away, noses wrinkled in disgust. "Move along, nothing to see here," the crowd seemed to chant, as if her existence were an inconvenience, an eyesore best ignored. Yet in the depths of her tattered satchel, a weathered envelope clutched close to her chest, held secrets that contradicted every assumption the world had made about her. The dirt on her cheeks wasn't just from the dirt of the sidewalks. It was the residue of a life erased by betrayal. She remembered the grand ballrooms, the silk gowns that whispered with every step, the laughter that once came easily. Now, her laughter was a distant memory, buried beneath the weight of judgment and the cruel twist of fate that had cast her into the shadows. They judged her too soon, she'd think on the rare nights when hope dared to surface, her fingers tracing the faded edges of the letter that promised a different tomorrow. But for now, she was just another face in the sea of forgotten souls. A woman everyone overlooked. Her days were measured not by the sun's arc, but by the rhythm of survival, scavenging for crumbs, avoiding the sharp glares of shopkeepers, finding shelter before the night's chill turned deadly. The world had erased her name, her history, reducing her to a whispered, "There goes that homeless woman," among strangers who'd never bothered to learn hers. Yet beneath the layers of grime and despair, a spark remained, a spark that refused to die, fueled by the quiet strength of memories no one could steal. Memories of a different life, a different self, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally surface. The park bench became her throne, the cardboard box her bed, and the stars her only audience as she rehearsed the words she'd say when that moment came. "I am not what you see," she'd practice, her voice a whisper at first, then stronger with each repetition. The city kept moving, indifferent to her silent rebellion. But Grace knew that somewhere, somehow, a thread connected her to the life she'd lost, a thread that might still lead her back. All she needed was a chance, a single kind eye to meet hers and see not the rags, but the woman beneath. Until then, she'd wait. Her secret past a flame she guarded fiercely against. The darkness. Every now and then, a stranger would pause. A tourist puzzled by her presence, a lost soul seeking solace in her quiet demeanor. They'd ask her name, her story, and for a moment, Grace would see a flicker of humanity in their gaze. But the questions always ended the same way. With a polite nod, a murmured, "Good luck." And then they'd walk away, back into their lives, leaving her with the familiar weight of being unseen. Homeless, not hopeless, she'd remind herself, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Because hope, she'd learned, was a luxury the streets rarely afforded. The seasons changed around her, spring's blossoms giving way to summer's heat, then autumn's crispness, and winter's cruel reminder of her vulnerability. Yet through it all, Grace remained, her presence a silent testament to resilience. The envelope in her satchel grew more fragile with time, but its contents remained intact, a promise she clung to like a lifeline. And though the world had long since stopped noticing her, Grace Whitfield hadn't stopped noticing herself. She was still here, still fighting, still waiting for the day when her true identity would shine through the darkness. The downtown plaza buzzed with life as Grace Whitfield navigated the sea of bodies with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being unseen. The clang of a street performer's cymbals, the hiss of espresso machines, and the chatter of tourists filled the air, creating a cacophony that drowned out her silent footsteps. Yet among the crowd, cruelty wore many faces. A group of teenagers, their laughter sharp and mean, tossed a half-eaten burger in her direction, shouting, "Hey, dirty bum! Here's your dinner!" Grace flinched, but kept walking, her boots avoiding the mess with practiced precision. The woman selling handmade jewelry at the corner stall sneered as she passed, muttering under her breath about trash ruining the neighborhood. A well-dressed executive nudged his colleague, nodding in her direction with a smirk, as if her existence were a joke to be shared over cocktails later. They judged her too soon, Grace thought, her fingers tightening around the weathered envelope in her coat. But the envelope's secrets were a silent counter-argument to their cruelty, a reminder that beneath the rags, she carried a legacy they couldn't see, and one day, they'd eat their words. The park, once a place of beauty and respite, had become a stage for the worst of human nature. Children screeched in delight as their parents pushed them on swings, their joy a stark contrast to Grace's solitude. A mother, noticing her watching from a distance, gathered her daughter protectively and whispered harsh words, her gaze cold. The little girl glanced back, confusion turning to fear as her mother's prejudice took root. Grace looked away, the familiar ache of invisibility settling in her chest. Homeless, not hopeless, she reminded herself, though the mantra felt frayed at the edges. She'd lost count of how many times she'd been spat on, cursed at, or avoided like she carried a plague. But the envelope whispered promises of a different reality, a reality where she was the woman they looked down on but refused to be broken. Until then, she'd endure the cruelty, one step at a time. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled, like a wounded animal, Grace would huddle in the alcove of an abandoned storefront. The graffiti on the walls told stories of rebellion and pain, mirrored in her own reflection in the cracked window. Passers-by hurried past, their breath visible in the frosty air, their eyes fixed ahead. No one noticed when she shivered, when her cough echoed in the empty space, or when tears froze on her cheeks. "You're invisible," the world seemed to say with every averted gaze. Yet in the silence, Grace cultivated a quiet strength, drawing from the reservoir of memories one could take from her. Memories of her father's warm laughter, her mother's embrace, and the mansion that had once been her home, a home stolen by betrayal. The envelope, now tucked beneath a loose brick for safekeeping, was her tether to that past. And though the crowds continued their cruelty, Grace knew that invisibility could be a weapon too. One day, she'd step into the light, and the world would finally see her. The day came when a young woman, no older than 20, approached her with a flimsy paper cup of coffee and a crooked smile. "Here, I thought you might need this," she said, her voice soft but uncertain. Grace looked up, surprised by the kindness in those brown eyes. The girl shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, perhaps expecting scorn or a plea for more. Instead, Grace nodded, her throat tight with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her chest. The girl lingered for a moment, then hurried away, her footsteps quickening as if afraid of the connection she'd briefly made. Grace sipped the bitter coffee, its warmth spreading through her like a balm. It was a small act, a flicker of humanity in a sea of cruelty, but it reignited something within her, a belief that maybe, just maybe, not everyone had forgotten how to see her. The city's heart was cold, but Grace discovered that even in the most frozen places, kindness found ways to seep through. An elderly man, his own hands trembling with age, pressed a crumpled dollar into hers one evening, his eyes gentle. "Bless you, miss," he'd said, before shuffling away. A homeless dog, thin and wary, had nuzzled her hand one morning, offering companionship without judgment. These moments, fleeting, unexpected, became Grace's anchors in the storm of indifference. They reminded her that while many mocked and ignored, there existed a quiet resistance to cruelty. And as she collected these small mercies, Grace began to understand that her journey wasn't just about surviving the crowd's cruelty. It was about preserving the humanity that the world sought to strip away. The envelope, still safe in her satchel, represented not just her past, but her future, a future where she'd reclaim her place and rewrite the legacy of those who'd tried to erase her. Yet even as kindness offered fleeting solace, the weight of judgment remained a constant. Companion, in the grocery store line, where she'd mustered the courage to buy a loaf of day-old bread with coins counted 3 times, the cashier's eyes had flicked to her frayed sleeves and lingered a beat too long. The unspoken question hung in the air. How could someone like you afford even this small luxury? Grace paid with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, her head held high despite the shame threatening to curl her shoulders inward. They judged her too soon, she thought, as she walked away. But the envelope's secrets were a silent rebellion against their assumptions. It was a document that would one day unmask her true identity, not as the woman they looked down on, but as someone whose worth couldn't be measured by appearances. Until that day, Grace would wear their judgments like a second skin, a painful reminder of how far she'd fallen and how much she had to rise. The rhythm of life on the streets taught Grace the cruel arithmetic of existence. $1 bought. 3 days of bread, one kind word could fuel a week of hope, and one act of cruelty could shatter months of hard-won resilience. Yet through it all, she clung to the belief that the scales would eventually tip in her favor. The envelope, now slightly more worn, but no less precious, was her equation for redemption. And as the seasons turned, Grace's quiet strength began to take root, preparing her for the moment when she'd stand before the very crowds that had mocked her and say, "I am not who you think I am." The day was coming, but until then, she'd endure their cruelty. One step, one breath, one silent tear at a time. In the darkest corners of the shelter, where the air smelled of mildew and despair, Grace Whitfeld found solace in the fragments of her past. Her fingers would trace the delicate stitching of a silk handkerchief her mother had given her, a relic from days when her world was one of manicured gardens and classical music. The memory of her mother's laughter, light and warm like summer, rain, would flood her senses, chasing away the damp chill of the present. "You are a Whitfeld," her mother's voice would whisper in her mind. "And Whitfelds don't break. They bend, they endure, and they rise again." Grace would close her eyes, letting the rhythm of that truth steady her breathing. The cruelty of the streets might have taken her home, her money, her reputation, but it couldn't steal the inheritance of resilience woven into her soul. And in those moments, clutching the weathered letter that hinted at a different future, she'd smile, a small secret smile that said, "You haven't seen the last of me." The park bench became her sanctuary, a place where memories could breathe freely. She'd sit there for hours, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, just as she used to do from the balcony of her childhood home. The bench's cold surface against her back was a stark contrast to the silk cushions she'd once lounged on, but Grace found a strange kinship in its unyielding presence. It stood, unwavering, through rain and shine, much like her quiet strength. People walked by, some pausing to drop coins in her cup with pity in their eyes, others scowling as if her existence offended them. But Grace paid them no mind. Her mind was elsewhere, wandering through the grand library of her family's mansion, where she'd spent countless hours reading poetry and philosophy. Those books had shaped her mind, given her the tools to build walls around her heart when the world tried to chip it away. Riches in disguise, she'd murmur to herself, thinking of the knowledge that no one could ever take from her. Her quiet strength was a tapestry woven from threads of loss and love. There was the memory of her father's hands teaching her to waltz, his deep voice singing off-key as they spun around the ballroom. There was the feel of the family heirloom, a sapphire necklace she'd once worn to a charity gala, cold against her skin, a symbol of heritage and grace. And there was the betrayal, the knife twist of discovering her uncle's greed had orchestrated her downfall. They judged her too soon, she'd think, her jaw tightening. But those memories, even the painful ones, were armor. They reminded her that she was more than the frayed coat she wore, more than the dirt smudged on her cheeks. She was the sum of her experiences, the heir to a legacy of dignity that couldn't be reduced to homelessness. And as she sat there, invisible to the world, Grace cultivated a quiet rebellion, a refusal to be defined by the ashes of her past. The old man who fed the pigeons in the square became an unexpected confidant. Every morning at dawn, he'd shuffle, over with a paper bag of stale bread, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "You're here early," Grace would say, her voice gentle. "Couldn't sleep," he'd reply, tossing crumbs to the birds. Their conversations were simple, anchored in the present, a shared appreciation for the way the light hit the fountain at noon, the scent of fresh rain on concrete. Yet in those quiet exchanges, Grace found a mirror for her own resilience. The man had lost his wife the previous winter, but still, he woke up every day to feed the pigeons. "Life's too short for bitterness," he'd say with a shrug. Grace nodded, thinking of her own losses. The letter in her pocket felt heavier then, a promise that maybe, just maybe, she could honor her family's memory by rising again. And as the pigeons cooed around them, she'd think, this is what quiet strength looks like, showing up, even when the world has given you every reason not to. On the nights when loneliness threatened to submerge her, Grace would visit the 24-hour diner 2 blocks from the shelter. The place was a relic of the past, with vinyl booths and a jukebox that still worked. She'd slide into a booth by the window, order a cup of black coffee, and watch the world through the smudged glass. The regulars, a night shift nurse with perpetually tired eyes, a truck driver who collects state quarters, a young artist sketching in a weathered notebook, barely noticed her. But Grace noticed them. She wove stories in her mind about their lives, their dreams, their hidden battles. "We're all fighting our own wars," she'd think, her coffee growing cold as she observed. And in those moments, she felt a strange connection to humanity, a reminder that her quiet strength wasn't just for her own survival. It was a thread in the larger tapestry of human resilience, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest nights, some light persists. The letter, still safe in her coat, seemed to hum with possibility, as if waiting for the right moment to change everything. There came a morning when the sky was the color of freshly turned earth, dark and promising. Grace woke before dawn, her body achy from another night on the shelter's thin mattress. As she walked to the park, the air carrying the promise of rain, she felt a shift. A subtle realignment of the stars, perhaps. The letter in her pocket seemed to grow warmer, as if aware of the change. Today, she thought, her pace quickening, is the day. Not that anything specific would happen. The universe didn't work that way. But Grace had learned to trust her intuition, that quiet voice that had guided her through countless nights of despair. And as the first droplets fell, painting her world in shades of gray and possibility, she knew that her quiet strength had prepared her for this moment, for whatever was coming next. The crowds would still judge, the world would still turn a blind eye, but Grace Whitfeld was ready to show them all what lay beneath the rags. And the letter? It would be her ally in the journey ahead. Grace Whitfeld knelt in the dim light of the abandoned warehouse, her calloused hands carefully wrapping a torn blanket around the shivering figure before her. The young man, no older than 19, had shown up at the shelter 2 days prior, his clothes little more than rags, and his eyes hollow with hunger. "I'm just passing through," he'd mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Grace had seen that look before, the look of someone who'd given up on being seen. She pressed a stale sandwich into his hands, her own stomach growling in protest. "Here, you need this more than I do," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, then flickered with gratitude as he took the offering. Homeless, not hopeless, Grace reminded herself, though the words felt like a balm over an open wound. She hadn't eaten properly in days, but watching the boy's relief made the ache in her chest a little less sharp. The community garden on the edge of town became her secret project. Every morning before dawn, Grace would slip through the fence, her fingers working the soil with a weathered trowel she'd found in a dumpster. She planted seeds rescued from a grocery store's trash, tomatoes, basil, lettuce, each one a tiny act of rebellion against the despair that tried to take root in her soul. The garden grew in fits and starts, battling neglect and the occasional frost, but Grace tended to it with a patience born of necessity. When the first sprouts pushed through the earth, green and defiant, she felt a surge of pride. "Life finds a way," she'd whisper to the plants, as if sharing a secret only they could understand. And when a single tomato ripened, plump and red, Grace picked it and walked to the shelter, offering it to a starving mother cradling her crying infant. The woman's tears of gratitude mirrored the joy in Grace's heart, a joy that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with connection. There were days when the pain threatened to overwhelm her, when the weight of betrayal and loss pressed down like a physical force. On those days, Grace would seek out the old man who sat by the river, his fishing rod a prop in a play no one watched. "Bad day?" he'd ask without looking up, his voice calm as the water beside him. Grace would nod, accepting the thermos of tea he always seemed to have ready. They'd sit in silence, the river's gentle flow washing away the sharp edges of her sorrow. The man never offered hollow comforts. Instead, he'd share stories of his own struggles, of losing his job, his home, his sense of purpose. "We all have our storms," he'd say, his eyes reflecting the setting sun. "But you, Miss Grace, you've got a light in you that ain't been extinguished yet." His words were a lifeline on days when her quiet strength felt more like a flickering candle than a steady flame. And as they sat together, Grace realized that small acts of kindness were her way of keeping that light alive, not just for herself, but for others who needed it as much as she did. The homeless dog that had been lurking around the shelter for weeks became her unexpected companion. She named him Max, after the loyal Labrador her family had once owned. Max was wary at first, his ears flattened against his skull as Grace approached, with a scrap of meat. But slowly, trust grew between them, a mutual understanding born of shared hardship. Grace would share her meager meals with Max, her fingers brushing his matted fur as he ate. In return, Max kept her warm on cold nights, his body pressed against hers in the shelter's drafty hallway. The shelter's manager had frowned upon their bond, muttering about rules and regulations, but Grace had stood firm. "He's family," she'd said, her voice leaving no room for argument. And in Max's unwavering loyalty, Grace found a reflection of her own resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest times, love could be found in the most unexpected places. The letter in her pocket, though still unread, seemed to approve of their small family, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets to them both. One afternoon, as Grace distributed donated sandwiches to a group of ragged children, a woman approached her with a bundle of clean clothes clasped to her chest. "I saw you helping my kids," the woman said, her voice trembling. "I don't have much, but these are yours if you want them." Grace accepted the clothes with gratitude, her heart swelling at the unexpected generosity. The woman's kindness was a mirror held up to her own actions, a reminder that small gestures could ripple outward in ways she'd never anticipated. As the children devoured the sandwiches with messy enthusiasm, Grace felt a familiar warmth in her chest. "This is why I do it," she thought, watching their smiles. The letter, still tucked safely in her coat, felt lighter somehow, as if the act of giving had unlocked a small piece of its mystery. Grace didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, surrounded by the chaos of need and the beauty of human connection, she understood that her journey wasn't just about reclaiming what had been taken from her. It was about becoming someone who could give back, a legacy woven not from riches, but from the small, quiet moments that made a difference in the lives of others. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, as Grace Whitfeld navigated the familiar path to the community garden. Her boots, though worn, carried her with a newfound purpose, each step a quiet rebellion against the invisibility the world had assigned her. The garden, her sanctuary of sorts, awaited her tending, a patchwork of resilient life that mirrored her own journey. But today, the rhythm of her routine was interrupted by a figure leaning against the weathered fence, his presence as unexpected as it was intriguing. Samuel Halstead, a man in his mid-30s with the air of someone who'd seen his share of the world's harsh edges, watched her with an intensity that felt neither intrusive nor dismissive. His suit, though slightly rumpled, hinted at a life once steeped in different circumstances, a contrast to the frayed edges of Grace's own existence. As their eyes met, something shifted in the air, a subtle acknowledgement that passed between them like a secret greeting. "You've got quite a green thumb," Samuel said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine curiosity rather than the pity she was accustomed to. Grace paused, taken aback by the simplicity of his observation and the respect it implied. No judgment lingered in his gaze, only recognition. For a moment, the weight of her circumstances felt lighter, as if the stranger had peeled back the layers of her disguise and seen the woman beneath. "It's just a garden," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "But it's mine." Samuel nodded, stepping closer but careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Mind if I join?" "You?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then nodded, her silent consent opening the door to a conversation that would ripple through the days to come. As they worked side by side, the easy flow of their words weaving a connection that defied the boundaries of their disparate worlds, Grace felt a flicker of something long dormant, a sense of belonging, of being seen. And in that rare moment of respect, the envelope in her pocket seemed to whisper, they judged her too soon. But not this man. The world, it turned out, still held surprises for those willing to look beyond the surface. Samuel's presence was an anomaly in Grace's carefully constructed routine, a variable she hadn't accounted for but couldn't ignore. As they kneeled together in the soil, their hands brushing against each other in the pursuit of nurturing life from the earth, he spoke of his own fall from grace. "I was a lawyer once," he said, his voice tinged with irony. "Represented the kind of people who'd turn their backs on someone like you." Grace's fingers stilled, but she said nothing, allowing him the space to confess. Samuel continued, his words spilling out like seeds finding fertile ground. "I let greed blind me to the truth. Now I'm just trying to make sense of what's left." The raw honesty in his voice was a balm to Grace's weary soul. For so long she'd been the subject of whispered judgments and averted eyes. Samuel's openness was a mirror held up to her own pain, a reflection that said, "I see you, and I understand." The garden, with its stubborn sprouts and unpredictable growth, became a metaphor for their conversation. Just as the plants pushed through cracks in the pavement, so too did their words find their way into the crevices of each other's hearts. When Samuel mentioned the letter, his curiosity gentle and unassuming, Grace felt a tug of instinct. She almost revealed its contents then and there, but something held her back, an instinctive need to protect the fragile bond they'd begun to forge. Instead, she offered him a single tomato from the garden, its skin glossy with dew. "For you," she said, her smile shy but genuine. Samuel accepted it with a nod of thanks, and in that small exchange, Grace realized that respect wasn't just about words. It was about seeing someone's humanity and choosing to honor it. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Grace allowed herself to hope that this chance encounter might be the beginning of something more, a story where she wasn't just the overlooked woman on the streets, but someone worthy of being seen. When Samuel returned the next day with a thermos of tea and a bag of fresh bread, Grace's heart skipped a beat. The world had taught her to expect cruelty or indifference, never kindness wrapped in such an ordinary package. "I thought you might appreciate this," he said, setting the items down beside her. Grace's fingers brushed his as she reached for the bread, and in that fleeting contact, a spark of connection ignited. They fell into an easy rhythm, their conversation weaving between memories of the past and tentative hopes for the future. Samuel spoke of his family's wealth, the expectations that had once bound him like chains, and the moment he'd realized that all of it meant nothing without integrity. Grace listened, her own story mirrored in his words. The letter in her pocket grew heavier with each passing minute, its secrets pressing to be told. Yet she held back, sensing that revealing it now would disrupt the delicate balance they'd achieved. Instead, she shared stories of her mother's love for gardening, of how the woman who'd raised her had found beauty in the most unexpected places. Samuel listened with rapt attention, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding that Grace had rarely encountered. As the afternoon wore on, they shared more than just words. They shared a moment of rare mutual respect, a bridge between two souls who'd been broken by the world, but had chosen not to stay that way. And when Samuel walked her back to the shelter that evening, his presence at her side felt like a shield against the judgment that usually followed her. They judged her too soon, Grace thought, her heart light with possibility. But Samuel had seen beyond the surface, and in doing so, he'd given her a gift more precious than any fortune, the gift of being seen. The days that followed brought an unexpected rhythm to Grace's life, a rhythm shaped by the quiet companionship of Samuel Halstead. They met at the garden each morning, their conversations deepening with each shared silence and spoken word. Samuel spoke of his search for redemption, of how he'd begun volunteering at a legal aid clinic in an effort to make amends for his past mistakes. Grace, in turn, shared memories of her family's philanthropic endeavors, of how her father had once said, "True wealth isn't measured in gold, but in the lives you've touched." The words felt like a bridge between their worlds, connecting Samuel's present to Grace's past in ways that defied explanation. One afternoon, as they sat on the garden bench watching the sunset, Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a business card. "I came across this while cleaning out my old office," he said, sliding it toward her. Grace picked it up, her eyes widening as she recognized the name. "Thompson and Associates, estate lawyers," she murmured, her voice trembling. The card felt like a key to a door she'd long believed sealed shut. Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. "I thought it might mean something to you," he said softly. Grace's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the connection she'd been waiting for? The letter in her pocket seemed to hum with anticipation, but before she could speak, Samuel placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise. And in that moment, Grace realized that the respect Samuel had shown her wasn't just a fleeting gesture. It was the foundation of something greater, something that might just help her rise from the ashes of her past. The world had tried to erase her identity, but Samuel had helped her rediscover it. One conversation, one act of kindness at a time. As the weeks passed, Grace began to notice small but significant changes in the way Samuel interacted with her. His eyes, once guarded, now held a warmth that suggested he saw her not just as a friend, but as someone whose story had begun to intertwine with his own. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the stars emerge, Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper article. "I think you should read this," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. Grace unfolded the paper, her breath catching as she recognized the name at the top. "Whitfeld Family Fortune, heir presumed deceased," the headline read. The article detailed the tragic fall of her family's empire, the betrayal by her uncle, and the assumption that Grace had perished in the fire that had claimed her parents' lives. A photograph of the charred remains of her childhood home stared back at her, a stark contrast to the memories that still lived vividly in her mind. Grace's hands trembled as she scanned the words, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. "But I'm not dead," she whispered, her voice breaking. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on hers. "I know," he said softly. "And now, so will the world." The letter in her pocket felt like a live wire, its secrets demanding to be unleashed. Grace looked at Samuel, her eyes wide with a question she hadn't yet voiced, but he seemed to understand. "We'll figure this out together," he said, his gaze steady and sure. And in that moment, Grace felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Trust. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and enemies who'd prefer her to stay hidden in the shadows. But with Samuel by her side, Grace began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim what had been stolen from her. The world had judged her too soon, but it was about to get a second look. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday, when Samuel arrived at the garden with a sense of urgent purpose. "I need to show you something," he said, his voice taut, with barely contained excitement. Grace followed him to a small, unassuming office above a bakery, the air thick with the scent of fresh pastries. Inside, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor greeted them. "Ms. Whitfeld, I presume," she said, extending a hand. Grace nodded, her throat tight with anticipation. "I'm Eleanor Thompson, from Thompson & Associates. Your family's legal team," the woman explained, her tone professional yet compassionate. Grace's mind reeled. They judged her too soon, she thought, her fingers brushing the letter in her pocket. Eleanor led them to a conference room, where documents lay spread out across a polished wooden table. "We've been searching for you for years," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Your uncle's greed didn't just steal your inheritance. It left legal loopholes that we've been working to exploit. With the right evidence, we can restore your name and your fortune." Grace's heart raced as Eleanor outlined the details. A trail of financial records, witness testimonies, and that crucial letter Grace had carried for so long. Samuel squeezed her shoulder in silent support, his presence a steadying force. As the weight of the revelation settled over Grace, she felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a fierce determination to reclaim what was hers. The world had tried to bury her, but she was far from finished. And with Samuel and Eleanor by her side, Grace Whitfeld was ready to step into the light and show everyone what lay beneath the rags. The journey had only just begun, but for the first time in years, Grace felt a genuine spark of hope, one that promised not just redemption, but a chance to rewrite her legacy on her own terms. Grace Whitfeld's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter for what felt like the 1,000th time, its edges frayed and ink slightly faded, but still legible. The document, yellowed with age, bore the elegant script of her late father, a man whose love had been as boundless as his wealth. "To my dearest Grace," it began, the words a balm to her wounded soul. The letter wasn't just a missive from the past, it was a lifeline, a cryptographic key to the hidden empire that had been stolen from her. Hidden within its folds was a list of assets, accounts, and allies who'd remained loyal despite the betrayal that had cast her into the streets. It was the one thing her uncle had overlooked in his greed, a single piece of paper that could unravel his carefully constructed lies. Grace pressed the letter to her chest, its weight a constant reminder that she was the hidden heiress, even if the world refused to see it. The envelope had become her armor, its secrets a rebellion against the life she'd been forced to live. And now, with Samuel's unexpected kindness reigniting her hope, Grace began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the letter's time had come to rewrite her story from beggar to beauty. But first, she'd need to trust someone with its contents, a risk that felt as terrifying as it was necessary. The origins of the letter traced back to the night of the fire, the night that had claimed her parents' lives and her family's legacy in one fell swoop. Grace had been away at university, blissfully unaware of the carefully orchestrated betrayal unfolding back home. Her father, sensing the danger, had sent the letter to her in a discreet package, accompanied by a single sentence that would haunt her for years: "Trust no one but yourself." The warning had come too late to prevent the disaster, but it had given her something invaluable: proof of her rightful inheritance. For years, Grace had carried the letter like a religious artifact, its presence an anchor in the storm of her existence. On the coldest nights, when despair threatened to consume her, she'd trace the familiar words with her fingers and whisper, "They judged her too soon." The letter was more than paper. It was her father's voice, his love, his belief in her resilience. And as Grace stood at the threshold of a new beginning with Samuel by her side, she knew that the letter's revelations would either be her salvation or her downfall. The choice, she realized with a deep breath, was no longer hers alone. To reclaim her legacy, she'd have to share its secrets and hope that the world was ready to see the truth beneath the rags. Samuel Halstead studied Grace from across the garden bench, his lawyer's mind already racing ahead to the implications of the letter she held so protectively. He'd seen similar documents in his past career, documents that could make or break fortunes, that could reveal hidden truths or bury them forever. But this wasn't just another case. This was Grace, a woman who'd become an unexpected friend, whose quiet strength had challenged everything he thought he knew about resilience and dignity. When she finally handed him the letter, her hands shaking with a mix of fear and determination, Samuel felt the weight of its significance settle on his shoulders. The elegant script, the precise details, everything about it screamed authenticity. As he read, his eyes widening with each revelation, Samuel realized that this document wasn't just a legal artifact. It was a battle cry, a declaration of Grace's true identity as the true queen among them. The letter outlined a web of betrayal that extended far beyond her uncle's greed, implicating powerful figures who'd benefited from her family's downfall. It was a dangerous truth to wield, one that could attract enemies as quickly as allies. But Samuel also saw the opportunity, the chance to right a wrong that had festered for years. And as he looked up to meet Grace's anxious gaze, he nodded, his voice steady with resolve. "We'll do this together," he said, echoing the promise he'd made days earlier. The letter, once a solitary burden, now felt like a shared mission, one that would either elevate them both or leave them standing in the ashes of Grace's second chance. The process of decoding the letter's full implications became an unexpected bond between Grace and Samuel. They'd spend hours in the dim light of the community center's back room, poring over legal texts and financial records that Samuel had retrieved from his old firm. Grace, though untrained in law, proved to be an astute learner, her mind sharp from years of necessity and her mother's insistence on education. "My mother always said knowledge was the one thing they couldn't take from me," she'd explain, her eyes bright with determination as she connected the dots between her father's annotations and the modern financial landscape. Samuel would smile, grateful for her quick wit and the way she challenged his assumptions. Together they discovered that the letter wasn't just a claim to wealth. It was a blueprint for exposing the conspiracy that had destroyed Grace's family. Hidden within the text were references to offshore accounts, coded messages to trusted advisors, and a posthumous plea from her father for justice. "From streets to starlight," Grace would whisper on particularly exhausting nights, the phrase becoming their mantra as they worked. The letter had transformed from a symbol of hope into a tactical weapon, one that required precision and courage to wield effectively. And as their partnership deepened, Samuel began to see Grace not just as a client or a friend, but as someone whose journey mirrored his own, a soul seeking redemption and a second chance. The world had tried to bury them both, but the letter was their shovel, digging a path to the truth. One evening, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Grace stood at the window of the shelter, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. The world outside looked like a fairy tale, the kind her mother used to read to her as a child. Yet the contrast between the beauty outside and the harsh reality inside weighed heavily on her heart. Samuel had spent the day making discreet calls, rallying the few remaining contacts he trusted from his previous life. "We'll be ready soon," he'd assured her that morning, his voice carrying a confidence that had grown with each step forward. Grace believed him, but the fear of failure lingered like a shadow. What if the letter wasn't enough? What if the powerful enemies they'd uncovered managed to silence them before they could act? She traced the familiar script of her father's words once more, finding comfort in the knowledge that he'd anticipated this moment. "You are stronger than you know," the letter seemed to whisper back. Grace exhaled, the winter air fogging the window as she pressed her forehead against the cold glass. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but for the first time in years, she felt prepared. The letter wasn't just a document. It was a promise, a legacy, and a fight she was finally ready to embrace. And as Samuel joined her at the window, his presence a warm contrast to the biting cold outside, Grace realized that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her father's memory, for the family that had been stolen from her, and for the chance to prove that a life-changing revelation could still emerge from the ashes of betrayal. The world had once spit on her, but now it would have to reckon with the truth. The moment of truth arrived on a Tuesday morning, when Eleanor Thompson appeared at the garden with a folder of freshly printed documents and a look of urgent determination. "We've got confirmation," she announced, her voice leaving no room for hesitation. "The accounts outlined in your father's letter are still active, and we've located 3 witnesses who can corroborate the timeline of the betrayal." Grace's heart raced as Eleanor explained the legal strategy, a carefully orchestrated plan that would begin with a quiet submission of evidence to the courts and end with a public revelation that would shake the foundations of the city's elite. The letter, once a secret Grace had guarded fiercely, was about to become a public declaration of her true identity. Samuel stood beside her, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder as Eleanor outlined the risks. Powerful enemies who'd stop at nothing to protect their interests, media scrutiny that could turn public opinion against them, and the very real possibility of failure. But Grace's resolve had never been stronger. She thought of the streets where she'd once been invisible, of the cruelty that had tried to break her, and of the small acts of kindness that had sustained her through the darkest times. This was her chance to show the world that her secret past was about to become their collective reality. As Eleanor handed her a pen and a copy of the initial legal filing, Grace took a deep breath and signed her full name for the first time in years. Grace Eleanor Whitfeld, heir to the Whitfeld legacy. The pen felt weighty in her hand, a symbol of the power she was finally reclaiming. And as she looked up to meet Samuel's proud gaze, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. The letter had done its job. It had brought her to this moment. Now, it was time to rise. The revelation unraveled like a tapestry woven with threads of gold and shadow. Grace Whitfeld, the woman who'd become a ghost in the city's memory, was once the heiress to a dynasty that had shaped the very skyline they stood beneath. Her family's name, Whitfeld, had been synonymous with luxury and philanthropy, a legacy built by her grandfather from the ground up and cherished by her father with an almost sacred duty. The mansion where Grace had grown up wasn't just a home. It was a testament to a legacy of giving, its walls adorned with artworks commissioned from struggling artists her parents had supported, its gardens open to the public every spring. "We take care of our community," her mother would say, her voice firm yet loving. But the betrayal that had torn it all away hadn't come from strangers. It had come from within, from the uncle who'd always resented the shadow of her father's success, who'd orchestrated a web of lies and arson to claim the fortune for himself. The fire that night hadn't just consumed her parents' lives. It had consumed their reputation, painting the Whitfeld name with the brush of scandal. Grace, presumed dead, had been erased from the narrative, her identity buried beneath the ashes. Yet here she stood, the truth burning in her chest like a wildfire ready to consume the lies that had held her captive. The world thought the woman they looked down on was a nobody. Soon they'd learn she was someone whose blood ran through the veins of the city itself. Samuel Halstead listened with a mix of awe and dread as Grace recounted her past, her voice steady despite the tempest of emotions that must have raged beneath. He'd known she was extraordinary from their first meeting. How could he not? But the full weight of her secret identity was a revelation that reshaped everything. "Your uncle," he said finally, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "He played his cards well." Grace nodded, her eyes distant. "He was the executor of my father's will. He twisted the evidence, made it look like my parents' death was no accident. By the time the authorities found my remains, the fortune was his." Samuel's mind raced. It was a classic move among the elite: exploit trust, manipulate circumstances, and rewrite history to favor the guilty. But what set this apart was the precision, the cold calculation that had left Grace for dead. "But why let you live?" he asked, the question burning in him. Grace's smile was grim. "Because he thought I was. The night of the fire, I was away at a friend's house. I didn't return home until it was too late. By then, the authorities had already concluded my parents and I had perished together." The tragedy of it all was almost poetic. Grace had survived the fire that had claimed her family, only to be consumed by the lies that followed. Samuel's respect for her deepened. She hadn't just survived. She'd endured years of being a ghost in her own life, and now she was ready to reclaim it. The letter in her possession wasn't just evidence. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would expose the truth and restore her name. The legal team Eleanor had assembled worked with an urgency that bordered on reverence. The documents they'd uncovered painted a damning picture of Grace's uncle, his allies, and the complicit officials who'd turned a blind eye to the fraud. "We've got transaction records showing transfers to offshore accounts days before." "The fire," Eleanor explained, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "And these witness statements. 3 household staff who fled after your uncle threatened them into silence." Grace's fingers tightened around the cup of tea she held, her knuckles white. The evidence was there, clear as day. But the road ahead was fraught with peril. Her uncle wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful, with connections that reached into the highest echelons of society. The thought of facing him sent a chill down Grace's spine, but it was tempered by the fire of vindication. "They judged her too soon," she thought, echoing, the mantra that had carried her through years of invisibility. This wasn't just about reclaiming her fortune, it was about restoring justice to a family that had been wronged. And as Samuel and Eleanor outlined the strategy, Grace felt a strange calm settling over her. The fear was still there, a familiar companion from her days on the streets, but now it was joined by something stronger: purpose. The world had once spit on her. Now it would have to reckon with the truth. The moment came when Grace stood before the mirror in Eleanor's office, dressed in a tailored suit borrowed from a client's donation, a stark contrast to the frayed coat she'd worn just days earlier. The reflection showed a woman transformed, her posture straight, her eyes sharp with resolve. The Grace Whitfield in the mirror wasn't the girl who'd been betrayed, or the woman who'd been forgotten. She was the heiress, the survivor, the truth incarnate. "They'll try to break you," Eleanor warned, her voice gentle but firm. "They'll question your sanity, your identity, everything you stand for." Grace nodded, already aware of the battles ahead. "But they're not counting on one thing," she said, her voice steady. "They're not counting on me." The words hung in the air, a declaration of war against the forces that had sought to erase her. Outside, the city continued its relentless march, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Grace took a deep breath, the weight of the letter in her pocket a constant reminder of why she fought. This wasn't just for her. It was for every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance, for every soul who'd been told their past defined their future. As she stepped into the hallway, Samuel by her side, Grace Whitfield became more than an individual. She became a symbol, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unbreakable thread that connected truth to justice. As the press conference room buzzed with anticipation, Grace stood backstage, her fingers brushing the letter one last time. Samuel adjusted her collar, his expression a mix of pride and nerves. "You've got this," he murmured, the words echoing the support he'd offered since their chance encounter. Grace nodded, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. The world beyond the doors was waiting, a world that had once turned its back on her, that had mocked and ignored and spat on her existence. But today was different. Today, she would reveal the truth beneath the rags. Today, the hidden heiress would step into the light and claim her throne. And as the doors swung open, Grace Whitfield walked forward, her head held high, ready to confront the legacy they'd tried to steal and the future that was rightfully hers. The memory of that fateful night still haunted Grace Whitfield like a shadow, its edges blurred by time, but its essence sharp as a knife. She'd returned from a weekend away to find her childhood home reduced to smoldering ruins, the acrid scent of smoke clinging to the air. The flames had consumed everything: her parents' laughter, the echo of her father's footsteps in the hallway, the countless memories etched into every room. But what the fire hadn't destroyed was the truth. This was no accident. Grace had arrived at the scene just as the firefighters were packing up, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed through the crowd. A neighbor, eyes red with tears, had whispered the words that would change everything. "They say it was arson." Grace had barely heard the rest. Her mind was racing, piecing together fragments of conversations overheard in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, her uncle's veiled threats, the tense arguments between him and her father. "He was jealous," Grace had murmured to herself, her voice trembling. "He always was." But back then, she'd dismissed it as family drama, something that would blow over. How wrong she had been. The authorities had moved quickly, their investigation marred by a lack of scrutiny that now seemed suspicious. The official report concluded that Grace and her parents had perished in the blaze, their bodies never recovered, a detail her uncle had exploited to claim the insurance payout and the fortune. Grace had been away, attending a friend's wedding, a fact that should have raised questions but was conveniently overlooked. They wanted it to be over, Samuel Halstead had remarked bitterly during one of their late-night strategy sessions. A quick burial meant a quick inheritance. Grace shuddered at the memory of the newspaper headlines. Tragic loss. Whitfeld family perishes in mysterious fire. The article had been accompanied by a photograph of her uncle, his face twisted in grief that Grace knew now was an act. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through family bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. But amidst the pain, Grace had found an unexpected ally in Samuel. His own history of ethical compromises had given him a unique understanding of the darkness they were up against. "Greed has a way of blinding people," he'd said one evening, his voice heavy with experience. "But it also leaves traces, and we're going to follow every single one." As Grace delved deeper into the past, memories surfaced that painted a clearer picture of her uncle's true nature. There had been the summer when Grace was 12, and her uncle had arrived at the mansion with tales of financial woe, his eyes pleading for help. Her father, ever the compassionate soul, had offered him a position within the family business, a generous gesture that had seemingly healed their fractured relationship. But over the years, Grace had noticed the subtle shifts, the way her uncle's smile never quite reached his eyes, the late-night calls he'd take in his study with the door locked, the whispers between him and certain business associates that had made her father increasingly anxious. "I should have seen it coming," Grace had whispered to Samuel one rainy afternoon, her voice choked with tears. Samuel had shaken his head, his hand resting gently on hers. "Hindsight is a cruel teacher," he'd said, "but it's also your greatest ally now." And so, they'd worked tirelessly, piecing together the clues that had been hidden in plain sight all along. The coded entries in her father's journal, the unsigned letters found in the study, the bank statements that hinted at irregular transfers, all of it formed a mosaic of betrayal that Grace was determined to expose. The legal battle that ensued was a labyrinth of deceit and counter-deceit. Eleanor Thompson and her team had uncovered evidence that suggested Grace's uncle had not only orchestrated the fire, but had also tampered with the initial investigation to ensure the blame fell squarely on Grace's parents. "He wanted to erase you completely," Eleanor had explained, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. "By declaring you dead, he eliminated any potential claim you might have to the inheritance." Grace had nodded, her mind racing. It was a brilliant move, one that had succeeded spectacularly. But the more they dug, the more they found inconsistencies, loopholes, that her father had likely anticipated and prepared for. The letter, with its detailed accounts and hidden assets, was the cornerstone of their strategy. Yet Grace knew that victory wouldn't come easily. Her uncle's influence extended far and wide, and they'd already faced several attempts to intimidate them into silence. A car accident, just waiting to happen on Samuel's way to work, a suspicious fire at the community garden, and anonymous threats left on Eleanor's office phone, all of it designed to break their resolve. But Grace's determination only grew stronger. They judged her too soon, she'd repeat to herself during the darkest moments, the mantra a shield against fear. She'd come too far to turn back now. The day finally came when Grace stood in the courtroom, the weight of the letter in her pocket a physical reminder of her purpose. Across from her, her uncle sat with his lawyers, his face a mask of controlled disdain. As Eleanor presented their evidence piece by piece, Grace watched his composure begin to crack. The coded messages, the financial records, the witness testimonies, all of it weaving a tapestry of guilt that left no room for doubt. When Grace took the stand, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, she spoke not just for herself, but for her parents, whose voices had been silenced too soon. "My father once told me that true wealth wasn't measured in money, but in integrity," she said, her gaze locked with her uncle's. "He would be ashamed of the man you've become." The courtroom fell silent as Grace laid bare the truth, her testimony a symphony of pain, resilience, and unyielding truth. When she finally stepped down, Samuel squeezed her shoulder in silent support. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Grace felt the tide began to turn in her favor. The world had tried to bury her story, but she'd fought her way back to the surface. And this time, the truth was on her side. As the judge's gavel fell, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, Grace exited the courthouse into a world that felt both familiar and foreign. Reporters swarmed their questions sharp and relentless, but Grace moved through them with a newfound confidence. Samuel walked beside her, his presence a bulwark against the chaos. "This isn't over," her uncle's lawyer hissed as they passed, his eyes narrowing with malice. Grace didn't flinch. She'd anticipated the threats, the attempts to undermine her narrative. What she hadn't anticipated was the swell of public support that began to emerge. Strangers approached her with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of betrayal and resilience. "You're giving me hope," one woman said, clutching Grace's hand before security could pull her away. The weight of the letter, once a solitary burden, now felt like a shared responsibility, a symbol of justice for many who'd felt forgotten. That night, as Grace reviewed the evidence one more time, she realized that the betrayal that had taken everything had also given her something invaluable: a purpose. A chance to rebuild, not just her own life, but to honor her parents' legacy by fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but Grace was ready. She'd been stripped bare by greed and lies, but in the process, she discovered her true strength. And as Samuel joined her on the balcony, the city lights stretching out, before them, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. The world had once cast her into the streets, but now she was rising, from streets to starlight, ready to reclaim not just her fortune, but her dignity. The knock on the shelter's door came on a morning when the sky was the color of storm clouds, heavy with the promise of rain. Grace Whitfeld had been tending to the garden, her movements mechanical as she tried to push away the suffocating sense of despair that had settled over her like a shroud. The fire, the betrayal, the years spent invisible to a world that had once known her name. It all felt like a dream she couldn't wake from. But as she opened the door and saw Eleanor Thompson standing there, a woman whose sharp eyes and determined jawline suggested a force of nature, Grace felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. "I've been looking for you," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of certainty that came from years of legal battles. "My firm was retained by an anonymous client to investigate the Whitfeld case, and what we found is nothing short of explosive." Grace's breath hitched. The Whitfeld case. Her parents, the fire, the stolen inheritance. It was all laid bare in Eleanor's words. "We've uncovered evidence that suggests your uncle's involvement in the fire wasn't an accident. What's more, we found records indicating that you were not, in fact, in the house that night." Grace's mind raced. She'd known the truth for years, but hearing it confirmed by someone with evidence was a game changer. Eleanor produced a folder from her leather briefcase, its pages filled with documents that felt like they could rewrite Grace's entire life. Financial records, witness statements, even a security footage from a nearby store that places you at a friend's house, miles away from the mansion during the time of the fire. Grace's fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, each revelation a brick being pulled from the wall of lies that had trapped her. "But why now?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Eleanor's smile was tight but genuine. "Because sometimes, justice has a way of finding its moment. And your moment is now." The weight of the news settled on Grace like a second skin, both exhilarating and terrifying. "This changes everything," Samuel Halstead said later. That evening, his presence a steadying force as Grace processed the information. They sat in the community center's back room, the air thick with the scent of old coffee and the weight of possibility. Grace nodded, her mind racing. "But what if it's a trap? What if this is just another trick to keep me down?" Samuel reached across the table, his hand covering hers in a gesture that felt oddly intimate. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "Whatever comes next, you won't be alone." As the days passed, Grace found herself caught in a whirlwind of legal preparations, media inquiries, and the slow, careful rebuilding of an identity she'd thought lost forever. Eleanor and her team worked tirelessly, their dedication to the case bordering on the personal. "Your family's story resonates with me," Eleanor admitted one evening, her guard down over a rare cup of tea. "My own father was wronged by the system once. I've spent my career trying to fix that." Grace listened, touched by the vulnerability in Eleanor's voice. It was a reminder that even those who seemed unflappable had their own battles. One of the many lessons Grace had learned during her time on the streets. The public's reaction to the news was a mixed blessing. Strangers approached her with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of hardship and resilience. "You're giving me hope," one woman said, her voice trembling as she pressed a crumpled dollar into Grace's hand. Others, however, remained skeptical, their eyes narrowing as they questioned her motives. "Why should we believe you now?" a reporter had sneered during one of the initial press conferences. Grace took a deep breath, channeling the quiet strength that had carried her through years of invisibility. "Because the truth doesn't need your belief to be real," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. As the legal battle gained momentum, Grace found herself standing at a crossroads, one that demanded she choose between the safety of anonymity and the risk of reclaiming her legacy. The letter her father had left her, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a live wire, its secrets demanding to be unleashed. They judged her too soon, she'd whisper to herself during the sleepless nights, the mantra a bridge between the woman she'd been and the person she was becoming. And as Samuel stood by her side, his belief in her unwavering, Grace realized that this spark of hope wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who'd ever been told their story didn't matter. The world had tried to bury her truth, but now it was time to watch it rise from the ashes. The days following the courtroom revelations were a whirlwind of activity, with Grace Whitfeld at the eye of a storm she could scarcely control. Her uncle, a man whose public persona had always been one of benevolent philanthropy, became a master of damage control. Smear campaigns emerged overnight, painting Grace as a mentally unstable individual seeking attention, a narrative designed to cast doubt on her testimony and the validity of the evidence presented. "This is a tragic case of a troubled young woman," his lawyers declared during a press conference, their words smooth as silk but sharp as blades. The media, ever hungry for a scandal, latched onto the drama with fervor. Headlines like "Heiress or Hoax" and "Whitfeld Fire, a cold case reopened" dominated the news cycles, each article more sensational than the last. Grace's social media accounts, once dormant and forgotten, were hacked and flooded with fabricated posts and messages aimed at discrediting her. Private moments from her time on the streets were unearthed and sensationalized, with tabloids painting her acts of kindness as mere publicity stunts. "They're trying to erase her again," Samuel muttered one evening, his jaw tight with frustration as they reviewed the latest batch of false accusations. Grace, though shaken, refused to let the attacks break her spirit. "They're scared," she said, her voice steady. "Scared that the truth will expose them for who they really are." Her resilience in the face of adversity became a rallying point for those who believed in her cause. Supporters began organizing grassroots movements, sharing her story on social media with hashtags like Dash Her Secret Past and Dash From Streets to Starlight. The more her enemies tried to push her back into the shadows, the brighter her light seemed to shine. The legal battle took a dangerous turn when anonymous threats began arriving at Eleanor's office. A brick through the window with a note reading, "Drop the case or else," a firebomb narrowly averted by quick-thinking security, and late-night phone calls filled with static and veiled threats. "They're getting desperate," Eleanor said during a tense strategy meeting, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Grace nodded, her mind racing. She'd anticipated resistance, but not violence. "We can't let them intimidate us," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We won't," he said, "but we also won't be careless." The team implemented tighter security measures, with Samuel insisting on accompanying Grace everywhere she went. It was a small comfort, but it helped. Amidst the chaos, Grace found an unexpected ally in an investigative journalist named Clara Rivera. Clara had been following the case from the start, her articles digging deeper into the Whitfield family's history and the murky dealings of Grace's uncle. "I've got proof he's been laundering money through offshore accounts for years," Clara revealed during a clandestine meeting at a dimly lit cafe. Grace's eyes widened as Clara slid a flash drive across the table. "This is just the beginning," Clara said. "He's got ties to politicians, corporate executives, people who do anything to keep their names out of the news." Grace realized that the battle was bigger than she'd imagined. It wasn't just about her family's honor. It was about exposing a network of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for decades. The weight of the responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders, but Grace felt a strange sense of purpose. "They tried to hide the truth," she whispered, echoing Clara's words. "But we're going to drag it into the light." The turning point came when Samuel uncovered a critical piece of evidence, a recorded conversation between Grace's uncle and a high-ranking official discussing the fire investigation. The audio was shaky, parts of it muffled, but the implication was clear. The official had been pressured to close the case quickly and rule the fire an accident. "This changes everything," Eleanor said, her eyes alight with determination as she listened to the recording. The team moved swiftly, leaking the audio to Clara, who published it in a blockbuster article that sent shockwaves through the city. Public outrage followed, with calls for resignations and further investigations. Grace's uncle's carefully constructed facade began to crack, revealing the corruption beneath. The legal tide shifted in Grace's favor as more witnesses came forward, their stories corroborating the evidence she'd presented. They judged her too soon, Grace thought, watching the news coverage with a mix of triumph and sorrow. The victory felt bittersweet. It had come at the cost of reliving her deepest pain. But it was a necessary step toward justice. As the case gained momentum, Grace found herself standing at the precipice of a new beginning. The world that had once shunned her was now watching with bated breath, waiting to see if she would truly rise from the ashes. Her journey had been fraught with danger and deceit, but it had also revealed the strength of the human spirit and the power of truth. And as Grace prepared to face the final showdown with her uncle, she did so not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by powerful enemies. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Grace Whitfield was no longer the woman they'd tried to keep in the shadows. She was a force of reckoning, and her story was far from over. The moment of reckoning arrived on a morning suffused with the golden light of early autumn, as Grace Whitfield stood before the grandeur of the courtroom, its marble columns and high ceilings, a stark contrast to the shelter where she'd once sought refuge. The air was thick with tension, the whispers of reporters and onlookers forming a hum that underscored the gravity of the day. Grace's fingers brushed the letter in her pocket, a talisman of truth and a promise of justice. This was it. No more hiding in the shadows, no more shrinking from the world's judgment. Today, she would rise. Samuel Halstead stood at her side, his presence a reassuring constant amidst the chaos. His journey alongside Grace had transformed him in ways he'd never anticipated. Once a lawyer consumed by ambition and greed, he'd found purpose in helping Grace reclaim her legacy. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Grace nodded, her resolve etched in every line of her face. "I've been ready for years," she replied, her voice carrying a strength that belied the turmoil within. The letter, the evidence, the unwavering support of Eleanor and Samuel, all of it had prepared her for this moment. Today, she would shed the mantle of the woman they looked down on and stand as Grace Whitfield, heiress and survivor. As Grace took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Across from her, her uncle sat with a mask of composed indignation, his lawyers poised to dismantle her testimony. But Grace had anticipated their attacks. Every question they posed, every attempt to cast doubt on her narrative, was met with a calm, measured response. "You claim to be the rightful heir," one lawyer sneered, "yet you vanished for years, allowing your uncle to manage the estate." Grace's gaze never wavered. "I didn't vanish," she said, her voice steady. "I was forced into the shadows by the very man who should have protected me." The words hung in the air, a testament to the years of struggle and resilience that had brought her to this point. The prosecution unveiled the evidence with meticulous precision. The security footage from the night of the fire, the financial records tracing illicit transfers, the witness testimonies that painted a damning picture of betrayal. Grace's uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat as each piece of the puzzle fell into place. Eleanor Thompson's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal artistry, weaving the evidence into a narrative of greed, lies, and the indomitable spirit of a young woman denied her birthright. "This isn't just about money," Eleanor declared, her voice resonating through the chamber. "It's about justice, about restoring the truth to a family that was robbed of everything." The jury listened, rapt and unmoving. As the judge instructed the jury to deliberate, Grace felt a hand squeeze hers. Samuel's eyes met hers, conveying a silent promise of support, regardless of the outcome. The wait was agonizing, each minute stretching into an eternity. Reporters buzzed outside the courthouse like a swarm of hungry bees, their questions muffled but persistent. Inside, the tension was palpable. Finally, the jury returned. Grace held her breath as the foreperson rose. "We find in favor of Grace Whitfield," the verdict echoed through the room, decisive and final. The courtroom erupted in a chorus of murmurs and footsteps, but Grace stood rooted to the spot. The letter in her pocket seemed to pulse with triumph. She had done it. In the days that followed, Grace moved with deliberate purpose. The media frenzy was relentless, but she navigated it with the grace that had defined her family's legacy. Interviews, press conferences, and public appearances became platforms for her to share her story, not just of betrayal and loss, but of resilience and hope. "This isn't just my victory," she said during a televised address, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's a victory for anyone who's ever been told their voice didn't matter." The words resonated with millions, turning Grace into a symbol of justice and perseverance. Her quiet strength had become a roar, echoing through the halls of power and into the hearts of those who'd once walked past her without a second glance. The journey had changed Grace in profound ways. She emerged not just as the heir to the Whitfield fortune, but as a woman remade by fire, a leader, an advocate, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As she stood on the balcony of the restored family mansion, the sun setting, in a blaze of orange and gold behind her, Grace felt the weight of the letter lift. Its mission accomplished, it was no longer a burden, but a cherished memento. The world that had once spat on her now looked on in awe. And as Samuel joined her, their eyes meeting in shared triumph, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was clear, a path toward rebuilding, toward healing, and toward honoring the legacy of a family whose name would shine once more. The hidden heiress had risen, and the light of truth would guide her every step of the way. Grace Whitfield stood at the edge of the bustling downtown plaza, the same spot where she'd once been invisible to the crowds. Today, however, the dynamics had shifted. A throng of people had gathered, drawn by the media's sensationalist reports and the air of impending revelation. Cameras flashed like fireflies around her, their lenses eager to capture every nuance of what promised to be a historic moment. Grace's fingers tightened around the letter, its familiar weight a source of strength. She glanced at Samuel, who stood nearby, his expression a mix of pride and anticipation. "Ready to shine?" he murmured, a smile playing on his lips. Grace nodded, taking a deep breath. The time for hiding was over. Today, she would reveal her true self to a world that had once judged her by her appearance alone. As Grace stepped forward, the chatter of the crowd faded into a collective hush. She cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within her. "I am Grace Whitfield," she began, the words resonating with a power she'd cultivated through years of silence. "The daughter of Eleanor and Richard Whitfield, whose lives were tragically cut short by a fire that was no accident." The crowd leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Grace's gaze swept over the faces of those who'd once averted their eyes, who'd spat on her existence. "I was presumed dead in that fire," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. "But I survived, a fact my uncle worked diligently to conceal." The murmur of the crowd grew louder, a wave of intrigue and disbelief washing through the assembly. Grace paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She reached into her coat and pulled out the weathered letter, holding it aloft for all to see. "This document," she declared, "is proof of my identity and heritage. It details the assets, accounts, and truths that my uncle sought to bury with my parents." The cameras zoomed in, capturing the evidence that would forever guide the narrative. Grace's heart pounded, but her resolve never wavered. "For years, I lived on the streets, unseen and unheard," she said, her voice tinged with a sorrow that had shaped her journey. "But today, I stand before you, not just as the heir to the Whitfield legacy, but as a symbol of resilience, a reminder that greatness can emerge from the most humble beginnings." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of voices as Grace's words sank in. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, their questions firing rapid and relentless. "How did you survive? Where have you been all these years? What will you do with the fortune?" Grace raised a hand, calling for silence. When the noise subsided, she smiled, a smile that carried the weight of triumph and the gentleness of forgiveness. "I won't be defined by my past," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "But I will use my legacy to honor my parents' memory and to help those who faced similar struggles." The words were met with a standing ovation, the crowd's energy transforming from skepticism to overwhelming support. Grace felt a tear slide down her cheek as she realized that her journey had reached this pivotal moment, a moment where she could finally reclaim her dignity and her voice. Samuel stepped forward, his presence adding gravitas to the revelation. "Grace's story isn't just about wealth or betrayal," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd witnessed her transformation firsthand. "It's about the indomitable human spirit and the power of truth to prevail against all odds." The crowd's applause swelled, a testament to the impact of Grace's courage. As the cameras continued to flash and the questions continued to pour in, Grace felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The weight of invisibility had been lifted, replaced by the empowering knowledge that her voice mattered, that her truth could inspire change. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. The world had finally seen her, and there was no going back. After the press conference concluded, Grace found herself surrounded by supporters, strangers whose lives had been touched by her story, each sharing their own tales of hardship and resilience. A young woman approached her with tears in her eyes, clutching a crumpled dollar bill. "You gave me hope," she whispered, pressing the money into Grace's hand. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with compassion. "Keep it," she said gently. "You'll need it more than I do." The woman's gratitude was palpable, a reminder that Grace's journey had become something larger than herself, a beacon of hope for those still trapped in the shadows. As Samuel helped her navigate the crowd, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear: to rebuild her family's legacy, to fight for justice, and to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. The world had tried to bury her truth, but Grace had risen from streets to starlight, ready to illuminate the way forward. The final act of Grace's revelation came that evening, at a benefit dinner organized by Eleanor's firm. The grandee ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and opulent decor, was filled with the city's elite, many of whom had once looked down on her. Grace entered with Samuel by her side, her posture straight, and her head held high. The room fell silent. As she made her way to the podium, the letter once again clutched in her hand. "Tonight," she began, her voice carrying across the space, "I ask for your support not just for me, but for the countless others who've been judged by appearances and denied their rightful place in this world." The crowd listened intently, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. Grace announced the establishment of the Whitfield Foundation, dedicated to helping the homeless and combating systemic injustice, a foundation funded by a portion of the very fortune that had been stolen from her. As she concluded her speech, the room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that signaled a shift in the narrative. Grace Whitfield was no longer the woman they'd once overlooked. She was a force of change, a testament to resilience, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope could rise from the ashes. And as the evening drew to a close, Grace knew that her journey was far from over. The road ahead was filled with challenges, but she was ready to face them, one step at a time, with truth as her guide and courage as her compass. The days following Grace Whitfield's public revelation were a blur of transformation and reckoning. As her story spread like wildfire across media platforms, the city that had once turned its back on her now struggled to reconcile the woman they judged with the truth that stood before them. The downtown plaza, once a stage for cruelty and indifference, became a symbol of her rise, a testament to how quickly public perception could shift when confronted with irrefutable truth. Among the crowd that day had been several familiar faces, individuals who'd once mocked Grace, avoided her, or worse, spat on her existence. A well-dressed businesswoman who'd sneered at her ragged appearance at a charity gala stood frozen, her perfectly applied makeup masking the shock in her eyes. A group of teenagers, their laughter once sharp enough to wound, huddled together, their faces pale with embarrassment as they realized the full extent of their cruelty. Even the woman who'd banned her from the community garden years earlier approached Grace with a trembling apology, her voice choked with tears. I didn't know," she stammered. Grace nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of their collective regret. "None of you did," she replied, her forgiveness genuine, but tinged with the recognition that apologies couldn't erase the past. The most poignant moment came when Grace encountered Mr. Henderson, the grocery store owner who'd once refused her entry because of her appearance. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face etched with shame. As Grace approached, he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Grace placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay," she said, her words carrying the weight of years of suppressed pain. "But remember this feeling. Let it be a reminder to look beyond appearances." Mr. Henderson nodded, tears glistening in his eyes as Grace walked away, leaving him to grapple with the magnitude of his past actions. The shockwaves extended beyond the immediate circles that had wronged Grace. Social media erupted with hashtags like "They judged her too soon" and "From Streets to Starlight," as people shared their own stories of prejudice and resilience. Strangers from across the globe reached out to Grace, their messages filled with admiration and a renewed commitment to kindness. The world, it seemed, was witnessing a collective awakening, an acknowledgement of the harm caused by hasty judgments and a willingness to do better. Yet, amidst the public's remorse, Grace remained grounded. She accepted apologies with grace, but didn't dwell on them. Instead, she channeled the energy into her mission, using her newfound platform to advocate for systemic change. During a televised interview, a reporter asked, "How does it feel to see the people who once scorned you now begging for your forgiveness?" Grace's response was measured and wise. "It's not about their apologies," she said, her eyes reflecting a depth of understanding born from hardship. "It's about the lessons we all learn from this. We're all capable of cruelty when we forget to see the humanity in others. My hope is that my story reminds us to look deeper, to listen more, and to judge less." The answer resonated with viewers, transforming Grace from a symbol of resilience into a voice of compassion and change. As the dust settled, Grace found herself standing at a crossroads of forgiveness and justice. While she couldn't undo the years of suffering, she could choose how to move forward. And in choosing mercy, she wasn't just offering redemption to those who'd wronged her. She was also liberating herself from the chains of bitterness. The world had once spat at her, but now it watched in awe as Grace Whitfield, the true queen, among them, led with a heart forged in the fires of adversity. And as she walked forward, the faces of those who'd once sneered faded into the background, their shame a distant echo in the face of her radiant rise. With the world watching, Grace Whitfield embarked on a journey to rebuild the Whitfield legacy, not just as a symbol of wealth, but as a beacon of justice and compassion. The first step was reclaiming her family's fortune, a process that required navigating the treacherous waters of legal battles and public scrutiny. Grace worked tirelessly with Eleanor and Samuel, her legal team, to ensure every account, every asset, and every piece of property was rightfully restored to her name. "This isn't about revenge," Grace said during a late-night strategy session, her eyes reflecting the determination that had carried her through darker times. "It's about using these resources to honor my parents' vision." Eleanor nodded, her respect for Grace deepening with each passing day. "Your parents would be proud," she said softly. Grace smiled, a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow crossing her face. The fortune, once a target for greed, now became a tool for good, a testament to the power of redemption. As Grace's influence grew, so did her commitment to making a difference. She established the Whitfield Foundation, dedicating a significant portion of her wealth to addressing homelessness and fighting for systemic change. "We've got shelters, but what we really need are solutions," Grace declared during a foundation meeting, her voice carrying the weight of her lived experience. The foundation launched initiatives to provide affordable housing, job training programs, and mental health support, holistic approaches designed to break the cycles of poverty and despair. Grace's hands-on approach set her apart. She visited shelters, volunteered her time, and listened to the stories of those she aimed to help. "You're not just giving us money," one beneficiary told her during a foundation event. "You're giving us hope." Grace's eyes welled with tears. "Hope is what kept me going," she said, her voice choked with emotion. The foundation became a living legacy of her parents' values, a bridge between her painful past and a future filled with purpose. Grace's transformation extended beyond her philanthropic efforts. She leveraged her platform to advocate for legal reforms, pushing for stricter regulations on ethical business practices and accountability for those who exploited others. "Corruption thrives in the shadows," she said during a TED Talk that garnered millions of views. "But light is a powerful disinfectant." Her speeches, filled with personal anecdotes and a clarity born of hardship, resonated with audiences worldwide. Grace became a sought-after voice in discussions about social justice, her unique perspective bridging the gap between the privileged and the marginalized. Yet, through it all, she remained grounded, her connection to her time on the streets serving as a constant reminder of the world's harsh realities. During a high-profile gala, a wealthy donor attempted to flatter her with comments about her rags-to-riches story. Grace's response was as graceful as it was firm. "It's not about the rags or the riches," she said, her smile warm but her gaze steady. "It's about the humanity in between." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a challenge to everyone present. The legal battles, though arduous, brought their own form of catharsis. When Grace's uncle finally faced trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators and media alike. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on the meticulously gathered evidence and Grace's unwavering testimony. As the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Her uncle's downfall wasn't a moment of triumph for her, but one of closure. "Justice isn't about revenge," she said to reporters outside the courthouse. "It's about making things right." The public's perception of her uncle shifted dramatically. The man who'd once been a revered philanthropist was now seen as the architect of his family's ruin. Grace's forgiveness, however, extended even to him. A forgiveness that baffled many, but spoke volumes about her character. "He's still my uncle," she said quietly during a family meeting. "And I hope one day he can find redemption too." The sentiment was unexpected, but genuine, a reflection of the grace that defined her journey. Grace's rise to power wasn't without its challenges. Critics emerged, questioning her motives and accusing her of exploiting her past for personal gain. "Is this just another rich person playing savior?" a journalist asked during a press conference, their tone skeptical. Grace paused, her eyes locking with the journalist's. "If my story helps even one person find hope, then yes," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I'm not playing anything. I've lived it, I've fought for it, and I'll keep doing so, regardless of what people say." Her authenticity resonated with the public, turning skeptics into supporters. Grace's willingness to engage with criticism head-on demonstrated a level of maturity and self-assurance that further endeared her to the masses. She became a symbol not just of resilience, but of integrity, a leader whose actions matched her words. And as the foundation's impact grew, measurable in lives transformed and communities rebuilt, Grace's narrative shifted from one of personal triumph to collective empowerment. "This isn't my story anymore," she said during a foundation anniversary event. "It's ours." The pinnacle of Grace's journey came when she returned to the abandoned mansion that had once been her home. Now restored to its former glory, it stood as a symbol of resilience and renewal. Grace converted it into a community center, offering educational programs, healthcare services, and a safe haven for those in need. On the opening day, the streets were lined with people who'd once ignored her existence, now united in celebration of her vision. As she cutting the ribbon, a young girl approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "You're really her, aren't you?" the girl whispered, her voice filled with awe. Grace smiled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "I am," she said softly. "And so are you." The girl's smile lit up her face, a moment of connection that reminded Grace why she'd fought so hard. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and betrayal, had been reborn as a testament to grace and redemption. And as Grace looked around at the community she'd helped build, she felt a profound sense of peace. She'd reclaimed more than her fortune. She'd reclaimed her dignity, her voice, and her place in the world. The journey had been long and painful, but it had led her here, to a life of purpose, surrounded by people who saw her not as the woman they looked down on, but as a beacon of hope. The Whitfeld Foundation quickly became Grace Whitfeld's magnum opus, a testament to her unwavering commitment to social change. Under her leadership, the foundation launched numerous initiatives aimed at uplifting the marginalized and empowering the voiceless. One of Grace's most ambitious projects was the Second Chance Housing Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to provide not just shelter but sustainable solutions for homeless individuals. "A roof over one's head is essential," Grace often said during foundation meetings, but without the right support, it's just a temporary fix. The initiative included job placement services, mental health counseling, and educational workshops, all tailored to address the root causes of homelessness rather than just its symptoms. Grace's hands-on approach set her apart from other philanthropists. She could often be found volunteering at shelters, serving meals, or sitting down with beneficiaries to understand their unique challenges. "You've got to listen to understand," she'd say, her voice carrying the wisdom born of her own experiences. The foundation's impact was profound, transforming countless lives and earning Grace a reputation as a compassionate and effective advocate for change. Grace's influence extended beyond direct service. She leveraged her newfound wealth to invest in innovative solutions to systemic problems. The foundation funded research into affordable housing models, supported legislative efforts to address poverty, and partnered with other organizations to amplify their impact.
"We're stronger together," Grace declared at a coalition meeting of non-profit leaders. Her collaborative approach fostered a network of support that reached far and wide, creating lasting change in communities that had once felt forgotten.
The foundation's success attracted attention from global leaders in social innovation, who sought Grace's insights and strategies. During a keynote speech at an international conference on poverty alleviation, Grace shared her vision for a world where no one was left behind. "Our greatest resource isn't money," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "It's our collective willingness to see the humanity in every person." The audience erupted in applause, recognizing in Grace a leader who walked the talk, a rare individual whose actions matched her words. The foundation's most transformative project was the Grace House, a state-of-the-art facility that combined emergency shelter, transitional housing, and community support under one roof. The facility, designed with input from those it served, became a model for other cities looking to address homelessness holistically. On the day of its grand opening, the streets were lined with supporters, many of whom had once been indifferent to Grace's plight. As she jammed the ribbon, Grace's thoughts turned to the young boy she'd once helped at the shelter, whose life had been turned around through similar programs. "This is for you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. The Grace House wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that second chances could rewrite destinies. And as guests toured the facility, they couldn't help but be moved by the stories of transformation that echoed through its halls. One former resident, now gainfully employed and reunited with his family, approached Grace with gratitude in his eyes. "You gave me back my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. Grace smiled, her heart full. "We did it together," she replied, her words reflecting the collaborative spirit that defined her work. Grace's journey with the foundation also brought her full circle in unexpected ways. During a foundation outreach event, she encountered Sarah, a woman whose story mirrored her own, a fall from grace, years of hardship, and a relentless pursuit of dignity. Grace took Sarah under her wing, providing not just financial support, but mentorship and encouragement. "You've got a fighter's spirit," Grace told her during a late-night conversation at the shelter's community kitchen. Sarah's subsequent transformation became a powerful narrative in its own right, amplifying the foundation's impact and inspiring others to believe in the possibility of change. Grace's approach to philanthropy was deeply personal, rooted in the understanding that those who'd experienced hardship were best equipped to guide others through it. "We don't just help people," she said during a staff meeting. "We empower them to help themselves." This philosophy became the cornerstone of the foundation's ethos, driving its success and sustainability. The most rewarding aspect of Grace's work, however, was the sense of community it fostered. The foundation's initiatives brought together people from all walks of life, business leaders, activists, volunteers, and beneficiaries, creating a tapestry of shared purpose. During a community garden project funded by the foundation, Grace watched as formerly homeless individuals taught children from underprivileged neighborhoods how to grow vegetables. The joy and pride on their faces reflected the foundation's broader mission not just to alleviate suffering, but to build bridges between disparate worlds. "This is what legacy looks like," Grace said to Samuel during a quiet moment at the garden's opening ceremony. Samuel nodded, his eyes reflecting the same sense of fulfillment. "Your parents would be proud," he said softly. Grace smiled, her heart full. The foundation had become more than an organization. It had become a living testament to resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit. And as Grace looked around at the vibrant community she'd helped create, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was her true legacy, not the wealth she'd reclaimed, but the lives she'd touched and the hope she'd reignited. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had led her here, to a life of purpose, surrounded by people who saw her not as the woman they looked down on, but as someone who had risen from the ashes to light the way for others. Grace Whitfeld stood at the grand opening of the city's newest community center, a state-of-the-art facility funded entirely by the Whitfeld Foundation. The space buzzed with energy, its walls adorned with art created by formerly homeless individuals, a vibrant testament to resilience and renewal. Grace moved through the crowd with an air of quiet confidence, her presence commanding attention without effort. The transformation was complete, from the woman who'd once been spat on and ignored, to a leader whose voice carried weight and whose vision inspired change. This was the final chapter of her journey, a chapter where she stood tall, unshakable, and impossible to overlook. The mayor approached her with a plaque commemorating the foundation's contributions, his words effusive with praise. "You've changed the face of this city," he said, his voice carrying the admiration of a community that had once turned its back on her. Grace accepted the honor with grace, her speech a blend of humility and unwavering resolve. "This isn't my victory alone," she said, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "It's the result of countless individuals who believed in a better future." The audience erupted in applause, their enthusiasm a reflection of the profound impact Grace's work had made. Among them was Samuel Halstead, his gaze filled with pride as he watched the woman who'd once been invisible become the center of everyone's attention. The media coverage of the event was extensive, with headlines like, "Whitfeld Foundation revolutionizes community support," and "From Streets to Starlight, Grace Whitfeld's final triumph." Reporters clamored for interviews, eager to capture the essence of a woman who'd risen from the ashes to become a symbol of hope. Grace handled each interaction with poise, her story now familiar but no less powerful in its retelling. "They tried to bury me," she said during one interview, her smile carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "But they didn't realize I was the seed." The metaphor resonated, becoming a rallying cry for those still fighting to be seen. As the event wound down, Grace found herself surrounded by individuals whose lives she'd touched. A young man who'd found stable housing through the foundation, a mother who'd rebuilt her life with the help of their job training programs, and the homeless dog, Max, who'd become a beloved mascot of the foundation's outreach efforts. Grace knelt to scratch Max behind the ears, her heart full as she looked into his loyal eyes. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she whispered, her voice catching with emotion. Max's enthusiastic wagging of his tail seemed to agree. In that moment, surrounded by evidence of her impact, Grace felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The woman who'd once been invisible had become someone who couldn't be ignored, a force of nature whose presence demanded recognition and respect. The final testament to Grace's transformation came when her uncle, released on bail pending appeal, approached her at the event. The man who'd once sought to erase her from existence stood before her with a humbled demeanor, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words barely audible. Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I know," she said, her voice carrying the weight of forgiveness, but lacking any trace of bitterness. "But today isn't about you. It's about them." She gestured to the community around them. The lives changed, the futures rebuilt. Her uncle's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. As he walked away, Grace felt no triumph, only a sense of closure. This wasn't about him. It was about the legacy she'd built from the rubble of her past. As the lights of the community center dimmed and the last guests departed, Grace stood, alone in the space she'd created, her fingers brushing the plaque on the wall. "For my parents," it read, "whose love and vision continue to guide me." Grace smiled, her heart full. The journey had been long, filled with pain, resilience, and ultimately triumph. She'd risen from the streets, reclaimed her identity, and rewritten her legacy, not as the woman who'd been betrayed, but as the woman who'd refused to be broken. And as she looked out at the community she'd helped build, Grace knew that this was only the beginning. The world had once tried to bury her story. Now, that story would inspire generations to come, a living testament to the power of resilience, compassion, and the unshakable belief that no one should ever be invisible again. And so, Grace Whitfeld's journey from the shadows to the spotlight became a legend, a testament to resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit. Her transformation wasn't just personal. It ignited a movement that reminded the world of the power of second chances and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Grace's story continues to inspire millions, proving that even in the darkest times, hope can rise from the ashes. If you were moved by Grace's journey, share what impacted you most in the comments below. Did you expect this ending, or were you surprised by her remarkable transformation? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content. Grace's legacy is just beginning, and there's so much more to explore.